It's the first week of July 1940, and on the beaches of occupied France, German fighter pilots are acting like they're on holiday. They're stretched out on deck chairs near Calais, drinking champagne they lifted from French cellars and staring across the 21 miles of English Channel like tourists planning their next stop. But these aren't tourists. They're Luftwaffe pilots. And in their heads, Britain is about to become the easiest trophy in an already ridiculous list. To understand that mindset, you have to see where their confidence came from. In just 8 months, they had rolled over Poland in 27 days, taken Denmark in 6 hours, taken Norway, smashed Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and then forced France, supposedly a top-tier military power with the largest army in Europe, to surrender in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. The Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe had just rewritten every rule of modern war, and German pilots carried personal kill counts that made them feel untouchable. Men like Werner Mulders and Adolf Galland were already multiple aces. Their Messerschmitt Bf-109s wore so many victory markings, the paint practically ran out of space along the fuselage. Now their attention was on Britain, and they weren't even pretending to respect it. From their point of view, the numbers told a simple story. The Luftwaffe had lost under 1,000 aircraft while destroying the French Air Force, which had started with more than 4,000 planes. So in their eyes, the Royal Air Force was next on the list and would fall even faster. Why wouldn't it? German intelligence literally described the British as a nation of shopkeepers. That wasn't just casual trash talk at the bar. That was a core belief inside the German command structure. Napoleon had mocked Britain with the same phrase more than a century earlier, and Hitler's generals were happy to recycle it like it was still deep inside. The math seemed obvious to Luftwaffe leadership. RAF Fighter Command had maybe 600 serviceable fighters. Germany had close to 2,800 combat aircraft staged in France, Belgium, Holland, and Norway. Of those, almost 2,400 were bombers, backed up by around 800 single-engine fighters and roughly 300 twin-engine Bf-110 destroyer fighters. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarshal and head of the Luftwaffe, told his air crews that British air resistance would be crushed in 4 days. 4 days. After that, Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, would go ahead. German infantry would march through London, and Churchill would be begging for peace terms before autumn. German airmen didn't treat this like a possibility. They treated it like a schedule. In the mess halls near Cherbourg or Le Havre, they didn't sit around arguing about whether they'd win. They argued over who would score the most kills before the RAF completely collapsed. Some pilots were actually annoyed by the idea that it might all be over too fast, that they wouldn't have time to build their personal scoreboards. There was real competition over who would shoot down the last RAF fighter. They had already met Spitfires and Hurricanes while covering the evacuation at Dunkirk in late May and early June. Yes, the RAF had flown hard to defend that retreat. Yes, the British Expeditionary Force escaped across the Channel. But from the German point of view, that was still a defeat. The British had been pushed off the continent and forced into the sea. And if you got kicked out, you were weak. In that mindset, a weak Air Force couldn't possibly hold out. Almost nobody in Luftwaffe High Command seriously entertained the idea that Britain could defend its own airspace for long. The only question was how fast they would fold. And the Luftwaffe's disrespect wasn't coming from nowhere. It was reinforced by what they believed was solid reconnaissance. Since May, German photo recon aircraft had been mapping British airfields. What they saw looked like proof. RAF stations looked thinly manned. Hangars looked half empty. The analysis reports being pushed up to Luftwaffe headquarters painted the same comforting picture every time. Fighter command was still shaken from the losses over France and Dunkirk and struggling to replace destroyed aircraft and dead pilots. And then there was the way the RAF actually flew. German fighter pilots had watched British formations in action during the French campaign and could not believe what they were seeing. The RAF was still flying in tight, polished little V formations called VICs, 3 aircraft wingtip to wingtip, neat and tidy, like an air show. It photographed well, but in a real fight, it was suicidal. German doctrine had evolved far beyond that back in the Spanish Civil War. German fighters flew in pairs, a leader and a wingman, with spacing, so each pilot could maneuver freely and cover the other. They called this the rotte, and it was brutally effective. The British system, by comparison, was a liability. Their formation flying was so tight that most pilots spent more energy avoiding collisions with their own squadron mates than scanning the sky for threats. In each 3-ship VIC, the number 2 and number 3 were basically locked into formation discipline, which meant only the leader could properly look for enemy fighters. It was flying like it was still 1918, all parade discipline, no survival instinct. German pilots openly joked that the RAF flew like schoolboys on inspection day. Adolf Galland, who would go on to become one of Germany's most famous aces, wrote that attacking RAF units felt like shooting wooden ducks at a fairground. And the hardware assessment didn't boost British credibility either. German intelligence correctly identified the Hawker Hurricane as the main RAF fighter. Hurricanes really did make up around 60% of fighter command strength. But from the German perspective, the Hurricane was slow, fabric-skinned, and outdated compared to the Bf-109. Some Luftwaffe briefing papers basically called it inferior in every possible category. The Supermarine Spitfire got a little more respect. Its speed and handling were known. But Luftwaffe pilots still believed they had the edge. The Bf-109E, the main version in service in 1940, could dive faster than any British fighter, use fuel injection so it could push into negative G maneuvers the British engines couldn't match, and carried heavier guns, including a cannon firing straight through the propeller hub. But here's the trap. German thinking was poisoned by success. They'd beaten every opponent so far using the same method. Poland overwhelmed them with speed and numbers. France smashed through with tightly coordinated fighter-bomber strikes and moved faster than the defenders could react. The formula had worked every time, so from their point of view, why wouldn't it work over southern England? German analysts weren't interested in figuring out what made Britain different. They were mainly looking for confirmation Britain would crack like everyone else. And they felt smug about pilot quality. German fighter training was serious. A typical Luftwaffe pilot went into combat with around 240 flight hours. They'd heard British replacements were being pushed into frontline squadrons with barely 100 hours of flying time. So the assumption was easy. German pilots were hardened professionals. British pilots were amateurs. What they either didn't know or didn't care to process was that a lot of RAF pilots in July 1940 were already combat tested from the battles over France, and the newer ones were being trained by those same combat veterans fast. The Luftwaffe equated inexperienced with inept. That mistake was about to cost them. Because while German pilots were celebrating their automatic victory, they were totally blind to three huge British advantages. The first one, the most important one, was something the Luftwaffe barely understood existed: radar. In the late 1930s, Britain had quietly built a chain of radar stations along the south and east coasts called Chain Home. By July 1940, more than 50 stations were live, with those distinctive steel towers that rose more than 350 feet into the air. These weren't toy prototypes. Chain Home could detect incoming formations at ranges up to roughly 120 miles and at altitudes up to about 25,000 feet. German recon planes photographed those towers again and again, but German analysts shrugged. Some wrote them off as experimental radio gear. Others assumed they were part of the Royal Navy's communications net. A few suggested they might be crude direction-finding sites. What almost nobody in the German system accepted was that Britain had already turned radio detection into a fully integrated air defense network. And that changed everything. Up to this point, the Luftwaffe's standard playbook looked like this: build a big strike package, send bombers with fighter escort, hit the target with overwhelming force, get out before the defenders can scramble and climb. That's how it worked in Poland. That's how it worked in France. By the time enemy fighters got to altitude, the Germans were already bombing or already gone. But Chain Home broke that timing. RAF controllers on the ground could watch German squadrons massing over France, track them crossing the Channel, predict their heading and height, and then direct British fighters to exactly the right place at exactly the right altitude before the first German bomber even reached the coast. Luftwaffe crews couldn't figure it out. They kept asking the same question: how are the British always in front of us at the perfect height? German officers convinced themselves the RAF must have lookouts everywhere, or that British fighters were burning fuel by circling and standing patrols around the clock. They never grasped the real answer. The British could literally see them coming from 100 miles out. The second advantage was the aircraft themselves, and here, German assumptions were oversimplified. Yes, the Hurricane had fabric skin. Yes, it was slower than the Bf-109. But it was also tough, steady as a gun platform, and could turn inside German fighters in a tight dogfight. On top of that, it carried 8 .303 Browning machine guns, throwing a combined rate of fire close to 9,600 rounds per minute. The Spitfire, meanwhile, wasn't just competitive. Under about 20,000 feet, the Spitfire could often outclimb, outturn, and outmaneuver the Bf-109E. Its iconic elliptical wings gave it a tighter turning circle than anything most Luftwaffe pilots had ever fought. German pilots who'd gone up against Spitfires during Dunkirk had tried to report this, but those reports were mostly brushed off by superiors as excuses for bad results. The third advantage was geography, and it sounds simple, but it was brutal in practice. RAF pilots were fighting over their own backyard. If a Spitfire went down over Kent, the pilot could bail out, float into a field, get picked up by local home guard, and be back in a cockpit by that evening or the next morning. If a Bf-109 went down over England, that was it. The airplane was gone for good. The pilot was dead or a prisoner. On top of that, German single-engine fighters barely had enough fuel for about 30 minutes of real combat time over British territory before they had to turn back across the Channel. RAF fighters could shoot, land 10 minutes away, refuel, rearm, and go right back up. The Luftwaffe was basically fighting with a timer tied around its neck, and they had done that to themselves. The first serious clash came on July 10, 1940. Most historians treat that as the official opening of the Battle of Britain. A group of Dornier Dos 17 bombers, escorted by Bf-109s and Bf-110s, went after a British convoy in the Channel near Dover. The Luftwaffe expected token resistance, maybe a handful of RAF fighters scrambling too late to matter. Instead, they ran straight into 6 squadrons of Hurricanes, all steered into perfect position with altitude advantage by ground controllers. The Germans lost 13 aircraft in that fight. The RAF lost 6. That should have forced a rethink. Instead, Luftwaffe command just explained it away. Göring's staff told themselves that British resistance was stronger than expected, yes, but only for the moment. The RAF, they said, had clearly thrown in the last of their available strength to defend shipping. Once that was burned out, the real air campaign could start. This became the narrative. Anytime the Germans hit tough resistance, it was framed as desperation on Britain's part. Tomorrow, the RAF would have fewer planes. Next week, they'd have almost none. Through mid-July, the fighting in and over the Channel, what the Germans called the Kanalkampf, escalated. German bombers went after coastal convoys and port facilities, testing British defenses and supposedly wearing down fighter command. On July 13th, a big strike on Portland Harbor ran into an ambush. Hurricanes and Spitfires tore into the bomber formations before escorting fighters could react. The Bf-110 destroyers, which were advertised as heavy long-range fighter escorts that could protect bombers and also handle enemy fighters, got mauled. On paper, the twin-engine 110 looked fantastic. It had the range the short-legged Bf-109s didn't have. It carried heavy guns. German propaganda had sold it as unbeatable. In actual turning combat against Spitfires and Hurricanes, it was a slow, heavy target. It couldn't turn with them, couldn't accelerate out of trouble, and couldn't disengage. By the end of July, some Bf-110 units were taking losses so fast they had to be rotated out just to survive. German pilot accounts from that period are revealing because you can watch the denial starting to crack. Hauptmann Hannes Trautloft, who commanded an elite Jagdgeschwader, wrote after a July 19th engagement, "The British pilots fight with unexpected determination. Their tactics remain crude, but their machines are equal to ours, and their courage cannot be questioned." And then in the next breath, he went back to insisting the RAF would shatter in a matter of days. Even when the evidence in front of them completely contradicted their assumptions, the institutional belief in an easy win was so strong that almost nobody dared challenge it. By early August, the Luftwaffe moved into what they called Adlerangriff, eagle attack, although bad weather pushed the main effort to August 13, 1940. The concept looked simple on paper: annihilate RAF fighter command in 4 days, with massive repeated strikes on airfields, aircraft factories, and radar stations. On August 8th, they threw a huge force at a Channel convoy codenamed Peewit. The Luftwaffe lost 31 aircraft. The RAF lost 19. German intelligence still filed that as progress, saying British defenses were continuing to weaken. On August 12th, the Germans launched focused raids on chain-home radar sites for the first time. Several stations were damaged and briefly knocked offline. But because they didn't really understand what those towers did, they underestimated the impact. By the next morning, most of those radar stations were back up, and German bomber streams were still getting intercepted with creepy accuracy. One Luftwaffe intelligence officer noted, "British fighters continue to appear in ideal positions despite our varied approach routes. Reconnaissance or informant networks must be extraordinarily efficient." They kept tweaking attack plans. They kept committing more aircraft. And they kept telling themselves the RAF was running out of planes. After all, everyone else had run out of planes. Then came August 15, 1940. The Luftwaffe called it the greatest day. It was supposed to be the knockout blow, a massive, coordinated three-direction offensive designed to swamp RAF defenses for good. Goering signed off on something bold: simultaneous strikes from France and the Low Countries in the south, plus, for the first time, attacks launched from Luftwaffe 5 bases in Norway and Denmark in the north. The northern wave would hit northeastern England, while the RAF was supposedly focused on defending the south. On paper, it was perfect. In practice, it turned into the bloodiest single day the Luftwaffe had faced so far. The morning began with confidence. At Norwegian airfields near Stavanger, crews of Heinkel bombers and their Bf-110 escorts got ready for the long flight across the North Sea. They'd been assured that Fighter Command had stripped northern England of modern defenses to protect London and the Channel coast. German estimates claimed that at most 1 or 2 weak squadrons were left in the northeast, probably still flying Gladiator biplanes from the 1930s. So, around midday, his 63 bombers and 34 Bf-110s took off expecting a milk run. Instead, they ran straight into 12 RAF squadrons of Hurricanes and Spitfires already waiting at altitude. Because once again, chain-home radar had seen them forming up almost 90 miles out. The result was a slaughter. With no single-engine Bf-109 cover, the 109s didn't have the range to escort them that far north. The twin-engine Bf-110s had to fight alone. They weren't hunting British fighters. They were desperate just to stay alive. Spitfires from 72 Squadron ripped through the bomber streams over Newcastle, and Hurricanes from 605 Squadron hit them again near Durham. German crews panicked, dumped their bombs over empty countryside, and tried to run for Norway. Out of almost 100 aircraft that started the mission, roughly 30 never made it home. Some were shot down so deep overland that their wreckage wasn't identified for decades. Others ran out of fuel and ditched in the North Sea trying to escape. The surviving crews sent back reports Luftwaffe headquarters did not want to see. British defensive strength in the north is far greater than intelligence indicated. We were engaged by modern fighters in overwhelming numbers. And while that disaster hammered the Northern Strike Group, the raids in the south were going just as badly. 5 major waves went in against targets from Kent to Hampshire, radar stations, ports, air bases. But instead of catching the RAF running on fumes, German squadrons met coordinated defense again and again at every stage. Near Portland, Bf-109s from Jägerschwader 27 got bounced by Spitfires from 609 Squadron, diving out of the sun, a move the Germans prided themselves on using. Oberleutnant Joachim Müncheberg, one of the Luftwaffe's rising stars, barely made it out after his wingman was shot down in the first few seconds. His combat report was blunt. Enemy pilots displayed exceptional awareness and aggressive tactics. Previous assessments of British pilot quality require immediate revision. Attacks on Martlesham Heath and Hawkinge airfields ran into heavy anti-aircraft fire and standing fighter cover. German bomber crews were used to interception, but they weren't used to this kind of layered ground and air defense. Dornier 17s from KG-3 were hit so hard over Kent that the group lost 11 aircraft in a single afternoon. For comparison, that same unit had lost 9 total in the entire Battle of France. By the time the sun went down, Luftwaffe crews limped back to bases in France and started counting the damage. 75 aircraft destroyed outright. Around 30 more so badly shot up they'd be in repair shops for weeks. Over 170 aircrew killed or captured. The RAF, on the other hand, had lost 34 aircraft, and of those pilots, 13 were already back in the air within 48 hours. It wasn't even close. The surviving German documents from late August and September 1940 tell a story official communiques didn't want to admit. This wasn't just about losing airplanes. This was about watching certainty die, one mission at a time. Take Ulrich Steinhilper, a Bf 109 pilot with the Jagdgeschwader 52. His entries in early July sounded like a travel diary. Weather excellent, spirits high, the English will not last long. By August 20th, after losing 3 wingmen in 10 days, his tone had flipped. We climbed to 30,000 feet, and still they're above us. We turned for home with fuel warning lights screaming, and they chase us halfway across the channel. Who are these pilots? Where do they keep coming from? Steinhilper survived the war, and later said those weeks in August 1940 were the most frightening of his entire combat experience, worse than Russia, worse than anything, because that was the first time he realized he might not win, and that fear had a face, the Spitfire. At the start of the campaign, seeing a Spitfire was interesting, not terrifying. By late August, bomber crews talked about Spitfires like nightmares. Hauptmann Johannes Steinhoff later wrote about it. You'd spot that distinctive elliptical wing shape sliding into position, and your stomach would just drop. Spitfire pilots could turn inside your turn, climb when you tried to climb, and by then they weren't being polite about it anymore. RAF tactics had shifted hard. British pilots started launching head-on attacks against bomber formations, a move German doctrine called suicidal because of collision risk. But the RAF kept doing it, and German bombers started flinching first. Heinkel and Dornier crews began filing vague reports about engine problems or navigation errors that forced them to abort before reaching target. Some of those were real mechanical failures. A lot of them were fear. Werner Milders, by then one of Germany's most celebrated aces and a literal national hero, submitted a painfully direct assessment on August 22nd. It was so blunt that Goering's staff actually censured him for it. Milders wrote, "The British pilot fights with tenacity and skill, equal to ours. Their aircraft are not inferior. Our numerical advantage is canceled by their defensive system, which remains impenetrable to our intelligence. Continuation of current operations will result in unsustainable attrition." That's not the voice of a man who thinks victory is guaranteed next week. That's someone watching the math turn upside down in real time. Letters home from Luftwaffe pilots show the same shift. Early in the summer, they wrote to family about walking through London soon, about how soft and decadent the British supposedly were, about how this whole campaign would be over quickly. By September, censors were intercepting letters that openly mentioned the loss rates. One letter from a pilot named Franz Stiegler actually made it through. "We do not speak of the missing anymore. There are too many to count. We drink in the evenings and no one mentions the empty chairs." The Luftwaffe was watching something it had never experienced before, a collapse in morale. Men who had flown 40 missions over France without hesitation suddenly came down with illnesses before channel sorties. Crew chiefs quietly reported pilots sabotaging their own planes in very small ways, that would ground them for a day or two without drawing suspicion, disconnecting a radio lead, claiming an oil pressure problem that didn't exist. Adolf Galland later said that by early September, he had to give motivational speeches before missions because he could see it in his pilots' faces. They expected to die. These were the same men who had been joking in July about spending their next leave in Brighton. The disaster of August 15th ripped through German high command. Within 2 days, Göring was raging at his intelligence chief, demanding an explanation for why Fighter Command still seemed to have endless reserves of pilots and planes, when he'd been promised the RAF was down to its last squadrons. Oberst Joseph Beppo Schmid, head of Luftwaffe intelligence, had nothing solid to offer. His August 16th briefing to Göring was a masterpiece of bureaucratic spin. He wrote that British fighter strength had been consistently underestimated, and that current operational capacity appears to be 600, 700 aircraft rather than the 300 previously assessed. In plain language, that meant we were wrong about basically everything. Hitler got his update on August 17th, and for the first time, Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, wasn't discussed like a done deal. It was discussed with conditions attached. The Kriegsmarine had already warned from the beginning that trying to move an invasion force across the Channel without firm air superiority was almost suicidal. Now, with the Luftwaffe unable to guarantee control of the skies, that warning got louder. Admiral Raeder told Hitler outright that landing troops on English beaches while the RAF was still operational would be a national-scale disaster. The original invasion timing, around September 15th, got slipped to September 27th, then to October 1st, and then quietly turned into when conditions permit. Those conditions never arrived. By late August, Göring made a dramatic strategic shift that looked bold on paper, but in reality was a panic move disguised as confidence. Instead of continuing to strike RAF airfields, which in truth was actually working and had already pushed several fighter bases to the edge of being knocked out, he redirected Luftwaffe efforts toward bombing London itself. The trigger he used was an RAF raid on Berlin on August 25th, which embarrassed Hitler publicly and gave Göring political cover to change the target. On September 7th, the Blitz began. Huge bombing raids against London and other cities. That change in focus took pressure off RAF Fighter Command's airfields at exactly the moment they were close to breaking. It gave them breathing room. Modern historians generally call that the turning point, where Germany effectively lost the Battle of Britain, even if Berlin refused to see it at the time. The delays kept stacking. On September 14th, Hitler's war diary included the line, "The enemy air force is by no means defeated. On the contrary, it shows increasing activity." That's careful military language for we were wrong and now we're stuck. Operation Sea Lion was officially postponed on September 17th and then shelved indefinitely on October 12th. The invasion barges that had been assembled in French and Belgian ports were scattered or reassigned. German newsreels continued to brag, but the internal papers show anxiety. By mid-October, the Luftwaffe had lost more than 1,700 aircraft since July. RAF Fighter Command, which was supposed to be wiped out in 4 days, was actually stronger than it had been at the start of the campaign, thanks to ongoing Hurricane and Spitfire production that German planners had failed to account for. The ripple effects hit German grand strategy. Hitler's attention started turning east. If Britain couldn't be knocked out quickly from the air and invaded across the Channel, then Germany would have to neutralize the Soviet Union first, grab its resources, and then come back to deal with Britain later. Directive number 21, the plan for Operation Barbarossa, was drafted in December 1940. The decision to invade the USSR in June 1941, which eventually destroyed Nazi Germany, was directly shaped by the failure to break Britain in 1940. The Luftwaffe's myth of being unbeatable died in British skies. They were still dangerous. They would still be feared. But now everyone, including their own pilots, knew they could bleed, and they could lose, and they could fail. That mental shift mattered more than any single sortie. And here's the bigger point about the Luftwaffe's collapse of confidence over Britain. It's not unique. This is a pattern that keeps repeating in military history, and every generation of leaders walks right into it thinking they're different. Look at the United States in Vietnam. By 1965, American leadership carried almost the same posture the Luftwaffe had in 1940. They ran the numbers and convinced themselves that the most powerful military on earth, total air superiority, advanced technology, endless industrial output, was going up against an enemy in sandals carrying AK-47s and Soviet cast-offs. U.S. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara and General William Westmoreland predicted victory in months if enough force was applied. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were dismissed as undertrained, under-equipped, and tactically inferior. Sound familiar? The United States dropped more explosives on Vietnam than all sides used in all of World War II combined, and still didn't get the outcome it wanted because it misunderstood the enemy's will to fight, their home field advantages, and their long-term patience. Washington kept insisting, "We're almost there," year after year. That is exactly the same language Göring used in August and September 1940. The Soviet Union repeated the script in Afghanistan in 1979. Soviet generals looked at the Mujahideen and saw tribal fighters with outdated rifles. The Red Army had helicopter gunships, armored columns, and full air control. They assumed they'd stabilize the country in weeks. 9 years and roughly 15,000 Soviet dead later, they pulled out in defeat. Why? Because they'd underestimated how well local fighters understood the terrain, how motivated they were, and how fast they could adapt. Soviet after-action reports from 1980 read almost like copies of Luftwaffe reports from August 1940. Constant confusion about why the enemy was still resisting effectively when on paper they were supposed to be broken. And even in 2022 and 2023, we watched Russia make almost the same mistake in Ukraine. Russian planning assumed Ukraine's military was corrupt, hollow, and ready to collapse. They expected to take Kyiv in days, to be greeted with shock and then resignation. Instead, they ran into Ukrainian forces who knew their ground, had trained hard with modern Western systems, and had zero interest in surrendering. Russian generals kept saying Ukrainian resistance was temporary, that just one more offensive would finally break them. That is almost word for word the way Göring described the RAF. The pattern does not change. What makes arrogance lethal in war isn't just that it leads you to make bad decisions. It blinds you to reality when those decisions start failing. The Luftwaffe saw evidence over and over that their assumptions were wrong. Instead of adjusting, they kept trying to explain the evidence away. That refusal to adapt is what doomed them. You can have better machinery, more fuel, and bigger numbers. You can have momentum. You can have momentum for months. But if you completely misread your opponent, if you refuse to respect what they're capable of, and if you close your eyes when reality doesn't match your plan, you set yourself up to lose. The lesson from August 15th, 1940, isn't only about Spitfires and Messerschmitts. It's about what happens when contempt replaces analysis, when you assume victory is automatic, when you're so loyal to your own story that you ignore the facts punching you in the face. Those German pilots lounging on the French coast in July had every reason to feel unstoppable, until they learned the hard way that confidence without respect isn't a strategy. It's a death wish. The RAF wasn't weak, and it wasn't amateur. They were defending their own sky with tools the Luftwaffe never bothered to understand. And in the end, that was the difference.